A human ship appeared without warning, and the galaxy understood its mistake. Too late, the alert did not announce itself politely. It arrived as a single data packet, standard format, the kind of transmission my terminal processed 400 times a day without requiring my attention. I had been reviewing demographic projections for a species. The compact had categorized as post-viable, a phrase we used when we meant something we did not want to say. Plainly, the report was 12 pages. I was on page 4. I had a cup of cooling liquid at my left hand that I had not touched in 2 hours. The alert sat in the corner of my screen and pulsed. I almost did not open it. That fact has stayed with me ever since. I almost did not open it, and the entire history of what followed would have been exactly the same, because what was coming did not require my attention to arrive. The universe does not wait for bureaucrats to look up. I opened it. The coordinates were wrong, not wrong in the way of a technical error or a miscalibrated sensor, wrong in the way that requires you to read the same line 3 times before your brain accepts the numbers as real. The detected vessel was not at the quarantine border. It was not in any disputed transit corridor. It was not even in the outer administrative zones where unauthorized traffic occasionally drifted and required a standard warning dispatch. It was here at the gravitational center of compact space, at the precise geometric heart of everything we had built and protected and governed for 4 centuries. I stood up. I do not remember deciding to stand up. My name is Kale. I hold the rank of senior architect, which means I design policies rather than enforce them. In practical terms, it means the decisions that shaped how the compact treated civilizations it considered problematic passed through my hands before they became official. I was good at identifying threats, better at containing them. It means I had signed the human quarantine order myself 212 years ago, measured in compact standard cycles. I had reviewed the file, considered the evidence, and put my authorization code on a document that sealed an entire species inside their own solar system, like sealing a room you did not want to deal with. The file had called them a Category 7 volatile, high aggression index, low cooperative density, resource extraction philosophy, incompatible with compact membership. The actuarial models projected internal resolution within 80 years. Most species in that category resolved within 80 years. A few took a 100. None had taken 200. I looked at the sensor data coming in from the detection array. I looked at the size estimate of the vessel. I looked at the coordinates. Again, the vessel was enormous. Not enormous by pre-quarantine human standards, which had been primitive. Small chemical propulsion craft. Fragile, short range, barely capable of reaching their own neighboring planet. Enormous by current standards, by everyone's standards, by standards that should not have been physically achievable by a species that had been cut off from every external resource and contact for 2 centuries. The compacts models had established their technological ceiling. 17 of the brightest actuarial minds across 9 species had built that ceiling with precision and care. I had read their work. I had cited it in 3 separate policy documents. The vessel on my screen did not know about the ceiling. I sent an immediate alert to the High Deliberative Council and copied the Defense Coordination Bureau. Then I pulled every piece of archived data on the human species that existed in the compact central registry. It filled 3 display screens. The most recent entry was from 47 years ago, a routine skin showing standard biological activity within the quarantine boundary. Population stable, no anomalous energy signatures. No anomalous energy signatures. I looked at my display screens. I looked at the vessel sitting at the center of our civilization like it had always meant to be there. The Defense Bureau responded. In 4 minutes, their preliminary assessment, the vessel was of human origin based on trace chemical signatures. The vessel was not transmitting in any recognized protocol. The vessel had not fired anything, activated any weapon signature, or made any gesture. The tactical models classified as hostile. It was simply there, present, waiting, and on its hull, visible to every scanner in range. Written in the universal chemical notation that predates any language currently spoken by any living species. A notation so old that we used it precisely because no single civilization could claim ownership of it. Were words. My translator took 11 seconds to render them. 11 seconds is a long time to wait. When your hands have gone cold, it rendered them as follows. We have been watching you watch us. I sat back down. The cooling liquid was still at my left hand. I did not touch it. My terminal showed 42 pending reports waiting for review. For 112 years of compact administrative process had produced a protocol for every situation I had ever encountered. In my career, there was a protocol for unauthorized border crossings. There was a protocol for first contact events. There was a protocol for equipment malfunctions, diplomatic breakdowns, species-level emergency, and resource allocation disputes that threatened interstellar stability. There was no protocol for this. There was no protocol for a ship that should not exist, sitting where nothing unauthorized had sat in 4 centuries, carrying a message that told you it had been watching you long before you looked up. I opened a new file on my terminal. I needed to give this a classification category before I could formally report it to the council. Classification was the first step. Classification made things manageable. Classification was what I did. I sat there for a long time, cursor blinking in the category field. I could not think of a single category that fit. The compact sent a delegation. Protocol required it. Protocol also required the delegation to be led by the individual most directly connected to the relevant policy. A tradition meant to create continuity, accountability, the sense that decisions had owners. I was the delegation's lead. I had signed the order. The chair of the council made this very clear when she called me directly, which she had never done before in my career. I spent the 4 hours between authorization and departure reviewing every first contact framework the compact had developed over its history. There were 19 of them. Each had been designed in response to a specific type of encounter. I identified the 3 most applicable ones, memorized the opening supplication sequence, and confirmed that my translation array was calibrated for every known human language. There were 412 of them on record at the time of the quarantine. I confirmed coverage for all 412. I boarded the diplomatic transport, feeling prepared. Preparation was the thing I did instead of feeling afraid. The human vessel did not dock with anything, it held position and extended. A single connecting bridge, a physical walkway pressurized, which told us their environmental needs matched what our records indicated: breathable atmosphere, standard gravity range. They had not changed much biologically. The airlock opened. One person stood on the other side. I had prepared for a delegation. I had prepared for a formal greeting party with hierarchy visible in their arrangement, weapons or the deliberate absence of weapons as a signal, some performance of their civilizations. Current status, 19 contact frameworks. All of them assumed a group. One person stood on the other side of the airlock. She was of average height by human standards, which our records had documented. She wore what my translator eventually identified as a jacket, soft garment with small interlocking metal teeth running up its front for closure. The teeth served no biological or environmental function I could identify. They appeared to be decorative or habitual, or simply a choice that no one had ever asked a human to justify. Her name, I would learn later, was Asha. At that moment I did not know her name. I knew her species and her file number, and the fact that she was standing alone in an airlock when she should, by every protocol I had ever studied, have been afraid. She was not afraid. I began the opening supplication sequence. It is a formal address, measured, respectful, designed to establish peaceful intent and acknowledge the lower status parties' right to speak without fear. We had used it successfully in 37 first contact events. It was well designed. I had always found it well designed. She waited for me to finish. That was the part that stayed with me longest in the days that followed. She did not interrupt. She did not react. She simply waited with the particular quality of patience that is not patience at all. It was the expression of someone who had already read the last page of the book and was being courteous enough not to mention it. When I finished, she spoke, not in Vorthos and Prime dialect, which our records showed pre-quarantine humans had learned the basics of through intercepted compact communications, not in compact common tongue, which every species with interstellar ambitions eventually acquired. She spoke in a human language. My translator identified it in 0.3 seconds. It was one of 412 human languages on record, and according to the census data compiled at the time of the quarantine, fewer than 8,000 humans had spoken it. It had been declining. Our records had flagged it as likely extinct within 2 generations. She spoke it without accent. She spoke it the way you speak a language that has always lived in your house. I processed this and said nothing for a moment, because nothing in my preparation had covered this specific opening move. You preserved it, I said, not a question. My translator rendered my words into the same language, which it could do because we had records. She looked at me with an expression I would spend a long time learning to read. It was not pride. It was not triumph. It was something closer to the face people make when they have done something that seemed so obvious to them that being credited for it feels slightly strange. We kept the languages you decided were not worth preserving. She said, "You are welcome." She turned and walked back into the ship. It was understood that we were to follow. I followed. The corridor inside was wider than I expected, well lit, clean in a way that spoke of maintenance as habit rather than performance. Not clean for our visit, clean because that was simply how it was kept. Other humans moved through the corridor around us. Some glanced at our delegation. Most did not. None of them performed submission postures. None of them moved aside. They navigated around us the way you navigate around furniture, acknowledging our physical presence without granting it particular significance. A human child, approximately 4 years old, by the developmental charts in our records, stopped and stared directly at my face for approximately 6 seconds. Then she turned to the adult beside her and said something in a fast, casual dialect my translator caught as, "That is what they look like." The adult nodded. Yes, they had prepared their children for us while we had been monitoring their energy signatures and writing ceiling projections and filing demographic reports. They had been preparing their children for the day they would walk down a corridor and see a fluorescent face and not be afraid of it. I filed this observation in the part of my mind reserved for things I did not yet know how to categorize. Asha led us through 3 sections of the vessel before I began to understand the scale of what I was looking at. The ship was not a transport vessel. It was not even a military vessel in any configuration. My tactical knowledge recognized it was all of those things simultaneously, which meant it was something new, something the Compact's design philosophy had never produced, because the Compact had never needed to produce everything at once. I saw engineers working at consoles that managed power outputs. My civilization's best facilities produced only controlled laboratory conditions. I saw a medical bay larger than most planetary hospitals I had visited, fully staffed with equipment that included surgical tools based on principles our medical research had theoretical papers on, but not working models of. I saw it. Schoolroom, 15 children seated, a human adult at the front with diagrams on a display wall. The diagrams showed stellar cytography. They showed the Compact's administrative zones. They showed the quarantine boundary and its documented history. They were teaching children where they had been and where everything else was and how the two related. Asha walked us past all of this without commentary. She did not explain or demonstrate or highlight anything. She walked as if this were simply what ships looked like. And if we found it remarkable, that was information about us rather than about the ship. At the end of the 3rd corridor, she stopped at a door and placed her hand on the panel beside it. "My captain would like to meet you," she said. "His name is Owen. He has been waiting to have this conversation for a very long time." She opened the door. Owen was seated at a table made of actual wood, real biological wood, which, in the context of a spacecraft, represented a choice rather than a practicality, a deliberate signal about the value placed on things that grew slowly. He was older than Asha. His face carried the particular quality of a person who had been patient for so long that patience had become a permanent feature of his expression rather than an effort. He looked at me the way you look at a problem you have spent your life studying and are finally able to examine directly. He said, "I read your original report, the one you filed when you authorized the quarantine." I said, "That report was classified." He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "it was." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the port hole behind Owen's head, I could see Compact Central Station in the middle. Distance, our home, our seat of. Government, the administrative heart of. 4 centuries of careful order, from. Here it looked very small. Owen did not speak again immediately. He let the silence do the work that sentences would have done less efficiently. I had used this technique myself in difficult negotiations, the deliberate pause that forces the other party to fill the space. I recognized it and still felt the discomfort it was designed to produce. I sat down not because he invited me to, because standing suddenly felt like a performance neither of us needed. How? I said. It was not a complete question. It was the only word that seemed accurate. He understood it as the complete question. It was. You gave us a box, he said. You assumed the box would be a punishment. We treated it as a workshop. He stood then and gestured for me to follow, and we walked back into the corridors of the ship, but a different section this time, deeper, where the sound changed quality and the air carried the faint metallic warmth of active industrial processes on a scale I had not encountered outside of dedicated planetary manufacturing facilities. The door at the end of the corridor opened onto a view that stopped me where I stood. The stellar forge occupied the center of the ship's lower half. It was active, running at what the ambient readings told me was approximately 60% of its operational capacity, which at 60% was producing the kind of energy output that required a dedicated solar installation on most worlds. Humans had built it inside a ship. They had built it small enough to fly and large enough to manufacture the composite materials that made the ship possible in the first place. The vessel had, in a very real sense, built itself, not all at once, across decades, generation by generation, adding capacity as it added knowledge. Civilization folded into an engineering project the size of a small moon. Owen watched me look at it. The first generation focused on surviving the initial period, he said. The second generation stabilized things. The third generation started asking what came next. By the fourth generation, the question was not survival. The question was what we intended to do with the answer. I thought about the actuarial models. I thought about 80 years. Internal resolution within 80 years. You nearly did resolve internally. I said it was not a question. The records from the quarantine's first 40 years showed exactly the kind of fragmentation the models had predicted. Yes, Owen said, we nearly did. He said it without shame and without drama, as a fact, a thing that had happened and had been survived and had become part of the foundation rather than the end of the story. Humans, I was learning, had a specific relationship with their own disasters, not the relationship of a species that had escaped disaster, but the relationship of a species that had survived it so many times that survival had become a design philosophy. They built everything to survive what had nearly destroyed them. We walked further. I saw hydroponics bays that produced enough food for every person on the ship with 20% surplus. I saw water reclamation systems so efficient they recovered moisture from the air itself. I saw 3 separate power generation arrays, each capable of running the entire ship independently, because humans had apparently decided that if one system failed, 2 more should be waiting. They over-engineered everything, not out of fear, out of the specific kind of respect for catastrophe that comes from having survived it personally. Asha was waiting for us at a junction in the corridor. She had a cup of something warm in her hand, and she offered one to me. I did not drink it, but I accepted the cup because accepting the cup seemed like the correct response to the gesture. She walked with us into a section of the ship that had a different quality to it, quieter, lit differently. The walls covered with materials that were clearly not structural. I stopped at the first wall and looked at it. Drawings, a child's drawings, adult drawings, paintings in various styles, photographs printed on physical paper, text, and dozens of different scripts. All of it fixed to the wall in a way that was clearly permanent and clearly deliberate, not decoration. Documentation. Memory made physical, our history. Section. Asha said, every ship has one. This one started being built about 130 years ago. I walked along it slowly. I recognized some of the imagery from pre-quarantine records, geographic features of the human home planet, faces that matched physiological records on file, objects that appeared in cultural documentation from before the quarantine was sealed. Then I noticed the wall extended past human imagery. I stopped. The imagery changed, different physiologies, different architectural styles, different star patterns in depicted skies, not human art, or rather human art depicting non-human subjects. You know what those are, Owen said from behind me. It was not a question. I knew what they were. 14 species, 14 civilizations that the Compact had quarantined at various points over its history. The Compact's records listed them by file number and classified their end states as internal resolution, the same phrase I had been reading in that demographic report when the alert arrived. 14 species that were no longer alive. Humans had documented them from inside their own quarantine using probes that the Compact had not detected because the probes were small enough and patient enough, sent across decades, recovering data from debris fields and empty planetary systems and the silence where civilizations had been. They had built this archive, this wall, this permanent record of 14 endings, and they had done it for civilizations they had never met and would never meet. I stood in front of a detailed rendering of a biological form I recognized from deep in the Compact's archives, a subspecies of my own people, the Vortesian branch, classified 600 years ago as a destabilizing element and quietly enclosed until they were no longer a factor in anyone's calculations. The rendering was precise, the facial structure, the specific jaw configuration, the way the secondary eyes sat slightly higher than the primary pair. I had seen that jaw structure in an old image once, a very old image, a family document that predated the Compact's current record-keeping system. I stood very still. For a long time, Asha stood beside me. She did not say anything. She did not point at the rendering or draw any connection or explain what it was. She simply stood beside me and let me look at it for as long as I needed to look at it. When I finally moved, she spoke. We did not build this to accuse you, she said. We built this because someone had to remember them, and there was nobody else. I did not respond, not because I had nothing to say, but because everything I might have said would have been inadequate in a way that was itself a kind of answer. Owen led me to the final room. He called it the archive. It was a large space, climate-controlled at a level that told you the contents were considered irreplaceable. along the walls and in the center of the room, organized in a system I could not immediately decode, were data cores. Thousands of them, everything we recovered, Owen said. Languages, histories, biological records, art, music, agricultural knowledge, building techniques, everything we could find in the debris, and the ghost signals and the empty spaces where 14 civilizations used to be. He looked at me directly. None of them knew we were doing this, he said. None of them asked us to, we just thought someone should. I looked at the data cores. I thought about the classification field on my terminal. Still blank, cursor still blinking. What do you want? I said. Owen looked at me for a moment, then at Ashad, then back at me. We want to show this to the people who made the decisions. He said, we want them to see what they decided, and then we want to have a conversation about whether the compact is going to be the thing it says it is or the thing it actually has been. He said it simply, directly, without performance. We are not here to destroy the compact, Ashad said. We are here because we spent 200 years figuring out how to save it. Archive hummed around us. 14 civilizations cataloged in the dark by people who had been told they were not worth saving themselves. I held my empty cup and said nothing. There was nothing to say that the room had not already said. Better, the High Deliberative Council of the Compact had not assembled full quorum in 60 years. The last time was a border crisis in the outer administrative ring that had threatened to split 3 member species into a bilateral conflict. We had resolved it in 9 days through mediation, resource reallocation, and the careful application of pressure that the compact had perfected over centuries. 31 species, 31 representatives sitting in the tiered chamber of Compact Central Station under the light arrays that had been specifically designed to accommodate 31 different visual spectra simultaneously. The chamber was built to communicate authority. It did this effectively. I had sat in it for important sessions before and felt the weight of it, the accumulated decisions, the history pressed into the architecture. I sat in the architect's seat, which was assigned to the individual who had drafted the relevant policy under discussion. I had sat in it before for other matters. It had never felt like it fit as poorly as it did now. The human delegation entered, 11 people, Ashad, Owen, and 9 others walking in together without any of the traditional markers of diplomatic hierarchy that our protocol teams had spent 3 days attempting to identify in their body language and arrangement. They simply walked in together as people who have a shared purpose enter a room. They did not sit in the designated lower status chairs. They did not make a statement about it. They did not make a show of choosing different seats. They simply moved to chairs that suited them and sat down. And the fact that those chairs were not the designated ones became a statement by virtue of being noticed and not addressed. Chair Drosk of the Council opened the session with the formal welcome address. She delivered it with the smooth professionalism of someone who had shared hundreds of sessions and could communicate authority through tone and pacing alone. I had always respected her for this. Ashad waited for the welcome address to conclude. Then she reached into her jacket and placed a data chip on the table. She slid it across the surface to me specifically, not to the chair, not to the center of the table. To me. We want accountability, she said, not Punishment, accountability. She paused to let the distinction settle. Punishment would mean we want the compact to suffer for what it has done, she continued. That is not what we want. Accountability means we want the compact to understand what it has done and to change the structures that made it possible and to do the work of making that change real and permanent. That is a harder thing than punishment. It requires the compact to remain intact and functional. We need you to remain intact and functional. The council was quiet. I could hear the environmental system cycling. The data chip contains documentation, Owen said from beside her. 200 years of observation conducted through probes that operated within the quarantine boundary. Every quarantine order the compact has issued in its recorded history. Every monitored outcome presented in the compact's own filing format using the compact's own classification language. He folded his hands on the table. We used your language deliberately, he said, so there would be no room for disagreement about what the records show. Prior of the Silene, who held the senior policy seat on the council's left tier, spoke. The Silene had been the most vocal advocates for the human quarantine 2 centuries ago. Vel's predecessors had written the threat assessment that formed the core of my authorization report. What the compact has done, Vel said, has been done within the legal framework of compact charter and with the consensus of member species. The actions described in whatever documentation you have prepared were not crimes under the laws that govern them. Asha looked at Vel for a moment. Yes, she said, we know. She said it without heat, without contempt, as a simple acknowledgement of a point. That did not change anything. That is part of what we want to talk about, she said. She asked the room's display system to accept her input, and it did. Standard protocol for diplomatic presentations. The data chip's content spread across the primary display wall, not the quarantine files, not yet. The first thing that appeared was a timeline, 400 years of compact administrative history presented in a single graphic that anyone in the room could read, regardless of species. Quarantine events were marked in a specific color. There were more of them than I had realized existed. I had worked within the system for my entire career, and I had not realized how many there were until I saw them all mapped together in a single image. 14 resolutions were marked differently. Smaller markers, specific coordinates, dates. The timeline sat on the display wall, and everyone in the room looked at it. Owen spoke quietly. We are not asking you to feel a particular way about what you see, he said. We are asking you to see it, to look at the full shape of it, because we believe that if you look at the full shape of it, you will understand why the structures that produced it need to change. Tervel spoke again. The arguments were technically sound. Resource allocation concerns the complexity of managing member species with incompatible development trajectories, the historical context of each decision, the fact that the compact had in each case followed its own procedures. They were the same arguments I had made in my authorization report for the human quarantine. I recognized the shape of them. I had built them carefully and believed them at the time. Listening to them now felt like reading a letter you wrote in your youth and no longer being the person who could have written it. Council member Fun of the Draveth species spoke next, the youngest member of the council, appointed 3 years ago, who had not been present for any of the decisions on the display wall and who, therefore, looked at it with different eyes than the rest of us. If we accept the premise of this documentation, F said, and I note that I am not yet expressing a position on that, if we accept the premise, then the question is what a corrective framework would look like, not punishment, accountability as the delegation described it. I would like to hear what that means. Specifically, Ashad looked at Owen. Something passed between them in the way of people who have discussed something so many times it has become wordless. She turned back to the council. 3 things, she said. First, the quarantine protocol is abolished, not reformed. Abolished any species that the compact classifies as incompatible with current membership standards is offered a supported development path, not an enclosure. Second, the remaining enclosed species are contacted immediately and offered that supported development path with whatever resources they need. Third, the archive, the documentation of what has already been lost, is formally adopted as a compact historical record and maintained permanently so that this cannot be forgotten again. The council deliberated. This took hours. This was correct. It should have taken hours. Decision being discussed was not minor, and treating it as minor would have been its own kind of insult. I sat in the architect's seat and listened to the argument cycle. Some members spoke of practical necessity, some spoke of precedent risk, some spoke of the charter and the limits of what the council could authorize without full member species referendums. All of it was technically valid, all of it was accurate, all of it was the kind of reasoning that had produced every decision currently displayed on the wall behind the speaking representatives. When the chair asked if anyone else wished to address the session before formal voting opened, I raised my hand. I had not planned to speak, or rather I had planned a speech. I had written it during the transit from the human vessel back to the station. It cited 14 precedents and proposed a modified framework that would preserve certain operational capabilities of the current system while addressing the most significant structural problems. It was a good speech, careful, documented, defensible. I put it face down on the table in front of me. I drafted the human quarantine authorization. I said I reviewed the evidence, I considered the arguments, and I believed I was being thorough. I believed the models. I believed the projections. I believed that the compact's procedures were sufficient to ensure that what we were doing was correct. I looked at the timeline on the display wall. I have been in the archive on that vessel. I said, I have seen what 200 years of humans working in a box we gave them produced. I have seen what they chose to do with their time and their capacity and their isolation. They could have spent that time doing what our models predicted. Instead, they spent it recording the histories of people they never met, preserving the languages we decided were not worth preserving, and building a ship capable of doing exactly what this ship has done today. I looked at Perderville. Our models were thorough. I said they measured everything the compact knew how to measure. What they did not measure, what we did not know how to measure, was this. I gestured at the delegation across the table. I am voting in favor of all 3 of the delegations requests. I said, not because I am instructed to, and not because I am afraid of what comes next if I do not, because I have seen the archive and I do not want to be the reason there is a 15th entry in it. I sat back down. Room was very quiet. Then council member Finn said very quietly, seconded. The vote took 6 hours. 6 hours is actually fast for the High Deliberative Council. In my career, I had been part of sessions that took 11 days. There were charter provisions for sessions that extended past 30. The compact had designed its decision-making to be slow, because slowness was considered synonymous with thoroughness, and thoroughness was considered the thing that separated governance from reaction. 6 hours for a decision of this weight. Was the council moving at a pace I had never seen it move? I watched the deliberation from the architect's seat and felt the shift in the room, the way you feel a change in air pressure, not with any single identifiable sense, but with the accumulated weight of all of them together. Something was different in the chamber. Something had changed in the posture of the arguments, in the quality of the silences between speeches, in the way representatives looked at the display wall and then looked at the human delegation and then looked at their own hands. Pryor spoke twice more. Both arguments were technically sharp, procedurally correct, and built on foundations I could not honestly call wrong. I had built similar foundations for 30 years. The problem was not the technical quality of the argument. The problem was that the display wall was still up and the timeline was still on it, and 14 small markers were still sitting at their specific coordinates, and no technical argument in any language I knew could make those markers do anything except stay exactly where they were. Vell's second speech ended. The chamber was quiet. Owen, who had not spoken since his initial statement, spoke now. We did not come here to collapse the compact. He said, I want to be direct about this, because I believe it matters. The compact as a structure has the capacity to be what it describes itself as being. We have studied its charter for 200 years. We have analyzed its founding documents. We believe the vision written into those documents is a good vision. What exists between that vision and the current reality is not a question of intention, it is a question of structure. He looked around the room. Slowly, structures can be changed, he said. We are living proof of that. We changed every structure we had. Some of the changes were very hard. Some of them happened because everything else had failed first. We are not recommending that path to you. He paused. We are recommending the other path, he said, the one where you see clearly and choose deliberately before the structures fail on their own. Ashat was looking at the display wall. There are currently 11 species in active quarantine status, she said. Not historical current, right now, today. There are 11 civilizations that are enclosed and being monitored and projected toward resolution timelines. She looked at the council. We know where each of them is, she said. We have been watching them for the last 40 years. 3 of them are in serious decline. 2 of them are showing the kind of internal fracture patterns that your models classify as pre-resolution indicators. She placed a second chip on the table. Those are their coordinates and current status assessments, she said, prepared by our analysts, cross-referenced with the compact's own data from monitoring stations, which we accessed through the same probes we used for everything else. No one asked how they had accessed the compact's monitoring data. The answer was visible in everything that had happened since the ship appeared. Somewhere in the last 40 years, human probes had become sophisticated enough to interface with compact sensor networks from the outside. The compact had not detected this because the compact had not been looking for it. The compact had been looking inward. Council member Fenn picked up the second chip and held it. Two of them are in pre-resolution decline, F said quietly. Yes, Asha said. How long? Fun asked. By our projections, Asha said, the faster of the two has perhaps 30 years. Slower has 60 to 80. These are approximate. Every variable accelerates or decelerates the timeline, Finn said. The chip down on the table, picked up a stylus, put the stylus down, looked at the display wall. We need to vote, Fun said. The chair called the formal motion. The motion was for the adoption of all three items as presented by the human delegation: abolition of quarantine protocol, immediate outreach to currently enclosed species, and formal adoption of the human archive as a permanent compact historical record. I watched the vote counter on my display. Pritter voted against. 6 others voted against. I had expected more. 24 voted in favor, 24 to 7. The counter sat there on my screen. I looked at my own ballot. It still reflected what I had cast. I checked it again. Same result. I was not sure why I needed to check it again. Number was not going to change. The chair announced the result in the formal register. Her voice did not change quality when she said it. Chair Drosk was very good at delivering information without performing a reaction to it, and I had always respected this quality in her. Asha closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she was not looking at the council, she was looking at Owen. He nodded once, then he took something from his jacket pocket, a small communication device, physical hardware, the kind of thing that operated on frequencies completely outside the compact's communication networks, and pressed a single button. He put it back in his pocket. I watched this. I noted it. I was about to ask what it meant. The observation officer on duty at the chamber secondary monitoring station made a sound. It was a very small sound. Involuntary, the kind of sound a person makes when they see something they were not prepared to see. Then every viewport in the chamber showed the same thing. I stood up from the architect's seat. There were ships outside, not one ship, not the human vessel that had been docked at Compact Central for the last 3 days. There were many ships. My monitoring display updated in real time as the compact sensor network processed what it was seeing. The numbers kept changing as new contacts resolved into identifiable vessels. They were appearing at travel emergence points throughout compact space, not at the center where the first vessel had appeared, distributed, one at each system with an enclosed species, one at each monitoring station that oversaw a quarantine boundary, a cluster at 3 specific coordinates that my memory connected slowly to the 3 species in serious decline that Asha had described. They were not in aggressive positions. They were not aimed at anything. They were not powering weapons or activating any electronic signatures. The tactical array flagged as threatening. They were present, simply, completely, unavoidably present. I counted what the sensor network had resolved so far. 107 vessels. The council chamber was completely silent. I looked at Owen. He was looking out the viewport with an expression I could not read, not satisfaction, not victory, not relief. something older than all of those things, the expression of a person who has carried a plan for a very long time and has finally been able to set it down. They have been in position since before we arrived. I said, yes, he said. Before the vote, yes, I thought about this. You positioned them before you knew how the vote would go. Owen looked at me. We knew how the vote would go. I looked at the display. 107 vessels holding position across the breadth of compact space at every point that mattered, waiting. They had been waiting during the entire session, during my speech, during the 6 hours of deliberation, during everything. If the vote had failed, I said, it would have told us what we needed to know. Owen said, and we would have made different plans. He did not explain what those plans would have been. He did not need to. The ships outside the viewports were a sufficient explanation of the range of options available to a civilization that had spent 200 years building in a box and had arrived at this moment having prepared for every outcome. The council was recovering from the visual impact. Voices were rising in the chamber. Chair Drosk was calling for procedural order. Pritter was demanding to know whether the ships constituted an act of aggression under compact charter definitions. Ashai looked at Vel. Read the charter definition of aggression carefully, she said. We did. 200 years ago we started reading your charter very carefully. Ships holding position and doing nothing do not meet the definition you wrote. The definition, you know this. Vel did know this. The visible evidence of that knowledge was not comfortable to observe. Council member Fun had moved to the nearest viewport and was looking at the ships. I walked over and stood beside Fun. They were always there, Fun said. No, I said, they were not always there. They were built there. There is a difference. Fun looked at me. Compact enclosed them. I said, we gave them a boundary and assumed the boundary would be the end of the story. They treated the boundary as the beginning of a project. Everything you see out there, all of it was built inside the space we decided was sufficient to contain them. I thought about the stellar forge, the material composites that required temperatures we could only produce in laboratory conditions, the school room with its seagraphy lessons, the wall of drawings and memories, the archive with its thousands of data cores holding the histories of 14 civilizations that had not survived long enough to build their own ships. Fun was quiet for a long time. What do we do now? Fun asked. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical. The kind of question you ask when you are standing at the border between one version of events and another, and you genuinely do not know how to cross. I thought about my classification field. Still blank, still waiting from the first morning when the alert arrived. And I could not find a category that fit. I thought about my grandmother's jaw in a rendering built by people who had never met her species, maintained by people who had no reason to remember her, except that they believed someone should. We do what the vote said we would do. I said, we go to the 11 enclosed species and we open the quarantine boundaries and we offer the supported development path, and we mean it. When we say it, we mean all of it. I turned away from the viewport. Owen and Ashai were standing together near the center of the chamber. The council was beginning to process the practical next steps, dispatch protocols, communication frameworks, the administrative machinery that had to move before anything real could happen. This was the part one knew how to do. This was the part one had spent my entire career doing. I walked to the center of the chamber. I would like to formally request, I said to the chair, that I lead the initial outreach delegations to the enclosed species. Given my role in the quarantine architecture, I believe it is appropriate that I be present for the process of reversing it. The chair looked at me for a moment. She was reading something in my expression, and I did not try to prevent her from reading it. Approved, she said. I walked to the table where Owen was standing. I did not have a prepared statement for this moment. I had not known this moment was coming when I first boarded his ship 3 days ago. The two species in accelerated decline, I said, the ones with the shorter timelines. Tell me where to start. Owen looked at me with that expression I had been trying to read since I first met him. The one that was not victory, not satisfaction, not any of the things I expected from a person who had just achieved something enormous. I understood it now, standing close enough to see it clearly. It was the expression of someone who had carried a weight for a very long time and had just found someone to help carry it. Clara has the coordinates. He said she will brief you on what we know about current conditions on the ground. He said it the way you say something that has been planned for a long time, because it had been. I walked to the door of the chamber, then I stopped outside the viewports. 107 ships held their positions in the cold light of compact space, each one at a quarantine boundary, each one waiting, each one built inside the space that we had decided was sufficient to hold a species until it was no longer a problem. Compact's models had been thorough. We had measured aggression indices and cooperative density scores and resource extraction philosophy ratings. We had measured everything we knew how to measure, and we had been confident in what the measurements told us. We had not measured what a species does when you take everything from it except time and necessity. We had not measured what people build when the only direction available is inward. We had not measured what it means to spend 200 years preserving the languages of people you were told did not matter, recording the histories of civilizations you were told had resolved, and drawing pictures of the ships you intended to build on the day you finally finished your preparations. I had signed a document 212 years ago. I had called it thorough. I had called it careful. I had called it correct. I had been measuring the wrong things. Clara was waiting in the corridor with a briefing file and a look on her face that said she had also been waiting for a very long time to hand someone exactly this. I took the file. I did not look back at the chamber. I did not look back at the ships in the viewport. I did not take any time to stand in a corridor and feel the weight of what had just changed, because the two species in accelerated decline did not have time for that. I started reading the briefing file. That was the beginning, not the end of the compact's mistake, the beginning of the answer to it.